The letter to the Hebrews. The author of this letter is anonymous, and people have wondered for a long time whether Paul wrote it or maybe one of his co-workers like Barnabas or Apollos, but really we just don't know. In chapter 2, we discover that the author had a first-hand relationship with the disciples who were themselves around Jesus, so we know that this letter is anchored in the teaching of the apostles. We also don't know who the audience of this letter was or even where they lived. The author knows them really well, and he assumes that they have a thorough knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures, especially the storyline of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, about how Abraham's family became the nation of Israel, about how Moses led them out of slavery in Egypt to Mount Sinai, where they received the Torah and they made a covenant with God, where they built the tabernacle, where the priests offered sacrifices, and also about how they wandered through the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. The author just expects that the readers know all of the details about these stories, and so most likely the audience is made up of Jewish Christians. That's where the name of the letter comes from. We also have clues from chapter 10 that this church community was facing persecution and even imprisonment because of their association with Jesus. Some in the community were walking away from Jesus and abandoning the faith altogether. And this explains the purpose and the structure of this letter. First, there's a short introduction, which is followed by 4 sections where the author compares and contrasts Jesus with key people and events from Israel's history. Jesus is first compared with angels in the Torah, second with Moses and the Promised Land, third with priests and Melchizedek, and lastly with the sacrifices and the covenant. And the author has 2 main goals in all of these contrasts. The first goal is to elevate Jesus as superior to anyone or anything else, showing that Jesus is worthy of all their trust and devotion. But his second goal is this: it's to challenge the readers to remain faithful to Jesus despite persecution. So in every section, he includes a strong warning not to abandon Jesus. So let's dive in now and see how this all unfolds. The elevation of Jesus begins in the opening sentence of the introduction. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors in many different ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. So the author's saying that Jesus is superior to all of the previous ways that God has revealed himself to Israel. He then makes this astounding claim that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's nature. These metaphors are making the closest possible identification between Jesus and God. So Jesus is what the rays of light are to the sun, or Jesus is what the wax impression is to the signet ring. For this author, there is no God apart from Jesus. Jesus is God become human as the Son. And it's this elevated view of Jesus that's then explored throughout the rest of the letter. In the first section, the author compares Jesus with angels, which might strike you as kind of odd, like why angels? In Jewish tradition, it was taught, based on Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2, that the Torah and the words of God were delivered to Moses at Mount Sinai by angels. And so by saying that Jesus is superior to angels, the author is claiming that Jesus and his message of good news are superior to all previous messengers of God's word. And so the first warning flows from this very point. If Israel was called to pay attention to the Torah that was delivered by angels, how much more should we pay attention to the message that was announced by the Son of God? And not only that, given Jesus' status high above the angels, how remarkable is it that he gave up that high status to become human, to suffer, and to die? In Jesus, we see God's greatest glory and God's great humility as Jesus sympathetically joined himself to humanity's tragic fate. In chapters 3 and 4, the author moves on to argue that Jesus is superior to Moses, who led the people of Israel through the wilderness and built the tabernacle. Jesus is also the leader of God's people, but in him we see not the builder of just a tent, but of all creation. Then the author retells the story of how the Israelites rebelled against Moses in the wilderness, and they lost their chance to enter into the rest that God offered them in the Promised Land. And so here comes the second warning. If Jesus is greater than Moses, how much higher are the stakes if we rebel against him? We also are in a wilderness-like environment where we have to trust God for the future rest in God's new creation. So let's make sure that we don't rebel like Israel did in the wilderness and lose out on God's gracious offer to enter his new creation. In chapters 5 through 7, the author then compares Jesus with Israel's priests that come from the line of Aaron. Their role was to represent Israel before God and to offer sacrifices that atoned for or covered over the sins of the people. But, he points out, the priests were themselves morally flawed people, and so they constantly had to offer sacrifices for their own sins as well as for everybody else's. Something more was needed. And so he then argues that Jesus was that something more. He's the ultimate priest. But Jesus did not come from the line of Aaron. Rather, Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek, that mysterious priest king from ancient Jerusalem, and he appears in the stories about Abraham. We also find in Psalm 110 that the Messianic king from the line of David will be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So the author's whole point is this. Jesus is the ultimate priest king. He's morally flawless, he's eternally available for his people, and so he's superior to any other mediator between God and humans. And thus comes his warning in this section. To reject Jesus is to reject one's best and only chance to be fully reconciled to God, so don't do that. Which transitions us into the last comparison in chapters 8 through 10. The author shows how Jesus' death on the cross was the ultimate sacrifice, superior to all the animal sacrifices offered in the temple. Those sacrifices had to be offered constantly, both daily, but also yearly on the Day of Atonement. Jesus offered his life once and for all, and it was sufficient to cover the sins of the whole world. And so the author warns the audience from walking away from Jesus. It's like turning your back on a gracious offer of God's forgiveness. Why would you do that? Jesus' sacrifice is permanent, he says, and it's the foundation for the new covenant spoken of in the prophets, where all sins are forgiven. So now that the author has elevated Jesus through all of these contrasts, this final section is one big challenge to follow Jesus. So think big picture. In Jesus, they have found God's very word. In Jesus, they have hope for the new creation. Jesus is their eternal priest. He's the perfect sacrifice. And so now they should follow all the great models of faith found throughout the story of the scriptures, and they should remain faithful to Jesus, trusting that despite whatever hardship and persecution, God will not abandon his people. That's the basic flow of thought throughout the letter, which the author calls right here at the very end a brief word of exhortation. Here's a couple of extra tips for reading this letter. Whenever the author quotes from the Old Testament scriptures, which is like every other sentence, stop and go look up the reference and read that quotation in its original context. And sometimes you'll be puzzled, but more often you'll see all kinds of extra cool connections that you would never notice otherwise. It's totally worth the effort. You should also just know that these warning passages, they're going to make you uncomfortable, and that's kind of the point. They're not there to make you afraid. They're there to show you that rejecting Jesus is foolish because he's so awesome. These warnings all serve the larger purpose of the letter, to show that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God's love and mercy. And that's what the letter of the Hebrews is all about.
Okay, so I think that video does a very good job of summarizing Hebrews. So I'm not going to really redo all of that for you. Okay, so who here has read Hebrews? A few of you, okay. So what was your impression of it? Did it seem like some large theological thesis to you? Well, if so, you're kind of partially correct. It is a tremendous body of theological insight. 13 chapters worth, in fact. But there's also a pastoral side to the book as well. As the video highlighted, each of those compare and contrast sections contained a warning that they, the audience, should not fall away from the faith. The author repeatedly encouraged them to stick with Jesus despite the clouds on the horizon. The author even says in chapter 13, verse 22, that this book is a word of exhortation, for in fact, I have written to you quite briefly. Quite brief indeed, right? Only 13 chapters of deep theological writing. Okay, this letter is structured similarly to the sermons of the day. So if you were going to synagogue, you would be hearing sermons, okay? In fact, the phrase that I just mentioned, that word of exhortation, in the Greek that is parakleseos. Okay, typically that refers to a sermon. The same phrase is used in Acts in chapter 13, 14, and 15. The place where Paul and Barnabas are at the synagogue, and they're asked if they have a message of encouragement for the people at the synagogue. That same word, parakleseos, is that message of encouragement. Okay, so it's a sermon. Interesting. I'm going to get back to that. Okay, authorship. Well, unlike many of the letters in the New Testament, this doesn't have a greeting. It's not signed by the author. So we're kind of left to our own devices to figure it out. So if we want to determine who wrote it and who the intended audience is, we have to basically figure it out from the contents. Well, luckily enough, there's 13 chapters of contents, and there are some clues in there. Okay, so number one, the author is anonymous. We don't really know. Might have been Paul, might have been Barnabas, might have been Apollo, maybe Luke, maybe Clement, Philip, we don't really know. There's been lots of debate over the years among the scholars, but no real consensus. If you ask me, my guess would be Apollos. And I have some pretty good reasons for that, but I don't know. That's just something we'll learn when we get there, right? It's a mystery. Okay, we do know some things though. Okay, it was almost certainly a man, due to the use of a masculine singular pronoun in chapter 11, verse 32, in which he makes a reference to himself. Okay, some along the way, like I want to say even as far back as the early church, had suggested maybe that Priscilla had written this. But I would say that this masculine pronoun probably negates that. Although this has come up again in somewhat recent history, within like the last couple of years, or couple of hundred years, there was a scholar who proclaimed that Priscilla was the author. So, okay, in chapter 2, verse 3, we see that the author had a first-hand relationship with the disciples. Okay, the disciples were the witnesses of the gospel in action. And this letter is anchored in the teachings of those apostles. Okay, we can determine that the author was a dynamic preacher. He crafted his work in the form of a first century sermon. This is probably the first and most complete sermon addressed to an established Christian community. Now, dating this is not exact. There are a lot of people who claim it was 59 AD when this was written. We don't really know. We know there's some boundaries on it, but we don't know exactly. But that's as good as any, right? There are some clues, and if you want to talk about it later, I can tell you what they are, but I'm not really going to go into it in any depth here. This letter is recognized for its rhetoric and its elegance, and it's acknowledged as basically one of the most persuasive New Testament writings. Who wrote this really knew what they were doing. Okay, the author was knowledgeable of the Old Testament and its interpretation. The author used more Old Testament quotations than any other book in the New Testament. And there are also many allusions to Old Testament texts that support his argument. The author must have been highly educated, well-versed in the use of rhetoric, well-versed in the use of the Greek language. There are some scholars that claim that passage that opens this letter contains the most perfect Greek sentence ever written. I don't know Greek well enough, I can't tell you, but that's pretty cool. His rich vocabulary reveals that he was probably well read. Okay, and that means something, because think about this. There weren't books back then. If you were well read, that means you had access to scrolls and you probably went to the synagogue and you listened to what was taught to you. So keep that in mind. Back then, you had to pay attention when you went to church, because there wasn't a Bible. So he brought many skills gained through advanced education to his work. So that's why it's considered to be such a great writing. We can also determine that he was a committed minister of Jesus Christ and was deeply concerned about his audience. He combined his knowledge of the Old Testament with his understanding of Christian tradition to craft this sermon, urging that group of believers to stay the course. He appears to have had a deep knowledge of the congregation's past and present, and communicated really great concern for them through his message. So that implies certain things. Probably he was a part of that group for multiple years. We don't know that for certain, but you can kind of make that conclusion. Okay, let's talk about the audience. Who was this for originally? Okay, well, it doesn't say, does it? But we can sort of deduce some things. We don't know who or where they lived, but they were from Rome or near Rome. In chapter 13, verse 24, there's a phrase, "Those from Italy greet you." Okay, that's kind of bizarre, but let me explain it. Okay, this alludes to the expatriates that left Rome during the persecution by Claudius Caesar. That occurred somewhere between 40 AD or 41 AD and 53 AD. Okay, there was somewhat of a little uprising, and the Romans, being the Romans, are like, bam, get out of here. Okay, so these expatriates were sending their greetings back to those that were left behind. Well, the expats were from Italy. They're sending word back to people in Italy. Rome was a logical place. At that point in time, it probably had close to 1 million people living in Rome. Think about that. 1 million people. Around 60,000 or so of them were Jews or Jewish Christians. Okay, so in Acts 18, verse 2, Paul mentions that he met Aquila and Priscilla, who had recently fled from Rome when Claudius expelled all the Jews. And that happened, like I said, somewhere around 41 AD to 53 AD. Okay, so here's an example of expatriates from Rome. So, making a logical jump here. Okay, the audience, well, they were probably Jewish Christians, and they had a strong background in Jewish worship and thought. So, they're not Gentile Christians, but Jewish Christians. So they understood a lot of stuff, especially like that video said about the Torah and the story and stuff. So, much like John's church in Ephesus, this was probably believers who were in a house church or multiple house churches. The author knew them very well, and he cared for them deeply. He assumed that they had a thorough knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures, especially the Torah. Obviously, this is important because this letter makes many references to Old Testament scriptures and requires a pretty good understanding of God's grand story, right? If you don't know how all of that played out, you're going to be a little confused when you go trying to read this. We also know that they had been Christians for a while. So the author is quite dismayed by their lack of spiritual maturity. And that was in, chapter 5, verse 11 through chapter 6, verse 3. There's a whole section in there where he says something to the effect of, by now you guys should be teachers, and here I am having to go back and reteach you rudimentary stuff. In chapter 10, we see that they were being persecuted and even faced imprisonment due to following Jesus. Because of this, some were abandoning the faith. Hence, the need for this writing. Okay, bear with me. This is all just information. I'll get to some good stuff here in a moment. I'm going to talk about this much about structure. Okay, first and foremost, that picture that they had was great. In my mind, that broad structure of Hebrews that was laid out in the video, it captures the essence of the book, but it doesn't get bogged down in minutia. If you go and look at commentaries, they will have like a 2-page outline of what's going on in Hebrews. And wow. They break it down into, well, how much is exposition and how much is exhortation? Like, ay. Keep it simple, please. My brain's waterlogged at this point. Okay, so there's a short introduction. God has spoken to us through his Son. It's followed by those 4 sections of comparing and contrasting Jesus with the key people and events of Israel's history. So the angels in the Torah in chapters 1 and 2, Moses in the Promised Land, chapters 3 and 4, priest and Melchizedek in chapters 5 through 7, and then sacrifice and covenant in chapters 8 and 10. In each of those sections, there's an exhortation in the form of a warning to not abandon Jesus. He challenges them to remain faithful despite the persecution they're facing. And as that video pointed out, that final section is just one big challenge to follow Jesus. And we've got like the Hebrews Hall of Fame and all of that good stuff. Beautiful stuff. Interesting thing there is comparing and contrasting. On the one hand, he's dangling a carrot to us, right? The encouragements of remembering who God is and what God has promised to do. On the other hand, he's also wielding a big stick, right? Giving you significant warnings to not fall away. There are 2 distinct types of literature found in Hebrews, exposition and exhortation. Exposition, where the author here is expounding the person and the work of Christ. Okay? The exhortation is where he's seeking to motivate the believers to try to keep them in the fold, not fall back, not slide away. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not a typical letter. It's structured like a sermon. Why is that? That's interesting. Think of it this way. Back then, they didn't have a Bible. What they had were scrolls. And scrolls were expensive, and they were rare. They were hard to get a hold of. So if you went to the synagogue and somebody brought out a scroll and read from it, you really listened, because that was your only opportunity to learn that stuff. Nowadays, I whip out my phone. I've got 63 different translations of the Bible. I can compare and contrast. I've got more extra biblical information than I can ever read in my lifetime. They didn't have that. Theirs was much more of an oral tradition, passed on generation to generation. Okay? This letter was truly a sermon that was probably meant to be read in one sitting to a congregation. Wouldn't that be fun? 13 chapters worth. We're not going to do that. I think. We haven't decided. Okay. That's enough about structure. How is this applicable today? Hebrews. Why are we doing Hebrews? Why couldn't we do something easy? Yeah, Revelation, that'd be fine. Well, we're facing the same problems today as they faced then, but these problems are wearing different clothing. They're the same but different. Persecution, whether overt or covert, is still ever present today. In America, we tend not to see so much overt persecution as in other places in the world. If you think it's a struggle to be a Christian in the USA, well, I ask you to consider the plight of, say, Christians in Iran or China or Russia or you name it. Places where you can get arrested, where you could be beheaded, where they could take everything you possess away from you. So persecution here is not as bad as it seems in the rest of the world, at least from an overt perspective. On the other hand, covert persecution is ubiquitous, and it's growing by the day. We see it in the bias of our mainstream media. We see it in the decisions made by those in our governments, from local all the way to federal. It affects believers even if we don't even recognize it. Some of us will rise up against it. Some will just ignore it. But some of us are going to lose our enthusiasm. It's going to get to us. Okay? What was the author's concern? That people were falling away. Well, let me tell you, people are falling away still. There's lots of reasons why. But I wish it wasn't true, but it is. Many are experiencing crises of faith, and they're losing their passion. Well, why is that? Perhaps you've noticed, life is not easy. It takes its toll on each and every one of us. Life pressures us in many different ways. Many of us are stuck on the hamster wheel and getting burned out. In my case, tyranny of the urgent. It's about to kill me. How do you get off of that hamster wheel? I got to figure that out. Some of us are bogged down in life's problems. Marriage issues, financial issues, health issues, children issues. Lots of issues out there, right? And this is unfortunate, but this is definitely true. Some of us have experienced tragic events in our lives. Death of family members, death of friends, job loss, accidents, divorce, financial disasters. Any one of those things is a tremendous stress on you. And guess what? Life can be cruel. Life can double up the pressure. You may be mired in a marriage issue when life decides to hammer you with a health problem, which then leads to financial strain. Yikes. A trifecta. I think you guys know what I'm talking about. You've seen it. You've lived it. It's hard to keep your mojo when life keeps beating you down. Am I right? Hebrews is an exhortation and an encouragement to stay the course despite the odds that are stacked against you. Okay, how is this applicable to our congregation? Well, when I look at our congregation, I don't see people who are falling away from the Lord. Yay, thank you. That's good. But I do see people who are languishing in their circumstances. It's difficult to see past the giant in your immediate path. I get that. Sometimes it seems insurmountable. But Hebrews provides us with encouragement to see that God is mightier than any circumstance. Some of us are stuck on a plateau, not moving forward, but not necessarily moving back. Some of us feel like our path forward is not really clear. Some of us feel like our train got derailed and we're just stuck. Our passion and our enthusiasm have both been depleted. I can speak directly to this because I spent many years on a plateau. I was isolated in the wilderness before God got a hold of me, shook me, and put me back on track. For me, 1991 through 1997 were dark years. Hebrew provides encouragement to recharge, to overcome, and move forward. Some of us believe that God can solve any problem. We have no problem saying God created the universe. He can do anything. Nothing's impossible for God. But when it comes to my specific problem, it's not on his radar. He doesn't care about my issue. He can solve it, but he doesn't choose to solve it. To me, that's obviously an issue of trust and faith. I suggest you ask for prayer if this is you. And read Hebrews, right? Because it's going to reinforce your faith in God. And it's not going to leave you with, well, I know he can do it, but he doesn't do it for me. Okay, my last one is this. And you guys are not going to like this. I didn't like writing it because it applies to me as well. Some of us have grown complacent. We like where we are. We like the trophies we've collected. We like the skins on our walls. We've been doing this a long time and we're proud of our achievements. I think I've heard myself say the following probably more than once, probably many times. Well, back in the day, we had it going on. I remember when John Wimber used to do his clinics, people were here, they were just left and right, just all over the place. And gosh, Dane Yarbrough used to teach in such power, our numbers were just swelling. Great days. But alas, that kingdom expression you saw 10, 20, 30 years ago, it's moved on. The front lines of this battle are always moving. What worked 20 years ago may not be appropriate now. We have to seek his guidance continually. We need new infilling. Those were great times. I am not discounting them at all. We cannot rest on our laurels. We got to move forward. This is also a form of languishing. You're not falling back, but you're not moving forward. Happy where we are and not necessarily willing to change and get back in the game. We like to say that if you're not moving forward, you're slipping back. Well, Hebrews can provide the encouragement to reignite your passion and get you moving again. Okay, well, let me wrap this up for you. I'm going to leave you with this, and I want you guys to pray about it. What side of the fence are you on? Are you slipping away? Are you languishing in your circumstances? Are you languishing in your complacency? Or are you approaching the throne of grace with confidence? It's your choice. Bottom line, you want to do it your way or do you want to do it God's way? And as Forrest said, that's all I have to say about that.